Good evening and welcome to the second session of Faith and Science Fundamentals. Let's get started on today's topic, science and truth. Last week, we looked at multiple definitions of science. Today, we're going to look at Leonard Brandon's definition, which is one more. His definition of science is from his book, Faith, Reason, and Earth History. For those of you who don't know who Leonard Brand is, he is a biologist, paleontologist, professor, and author of numerous books about faith and science. And this book, Faith, Reason, and Earth History, is a fantastic book that comprehensively covers all the topics that we are going to talk about in this webinar series. The digital version is available for free on the internet. If you put the title into any web browser, you will be able to find it and the instructions on how to download it. Though, it is a rather thick book and can be a bit technical at times, and at this moment, it is only available in English. Dr. Brand defines science as a search for truth through repeated observation and experiment. Do you remember that on the first day we talked about the similarities and the differences between science, philosophy, and religion? We could say that they're all similar, they all look for the truth, but once again, the way they do it is different. Philosophers had very diverse ways of looking for truth. I'm sure that in high school you studied about Plato and his allegory of the cave. According to Plato, true reality is intelligible and is found in the world of ideas, while the reality that we perceive with our senses are simply distorted shadows of that truth. There are philosophical currents, such as extreme relativism, that consider that the truth simply does not exist, but depends on the context. What is true for me may be different from what is true for you. However, most philosophers and other people believe that there is a truth independent of what people think, and an objective reality that we can access. How is religion related to truth? Although there are many religions, when I speak of religion in this context, I usually mean the main monotheistic religions: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and in most cases specifically to Christianity. Within Christianity, there are many versions, a great variety of Christian religions, and curiously, many of them believe that they are in possession of the truth despite having substantially different doctrinal studies or bodies. Many of these Christian religions agree that the Bible contains the truth, even though they interpret them in different ways. If we turn to the Bible itself for answers about truth, we find that truth cannot be possessed because truth is a person. Jesus affirms that he is the way, the truth, and the life. So those of us who accept the Bible as a source of authority should conclude that if we want to get closer to the truth, we should get closer to Jesus. Keep this idea in mind because we will return to it at the end. What is the relationship of science and truth? If we pay attention to advertising, science and truth are practically equivalent. There are dozens of advertisements that include scientifically proven claims, references to famous scientists, scientific vocabulary, and the like, because in our society, science is associated with truth. And if science says a product, it works, it has to be true. But we all know that we cannot trust advertising. What do scholars think? I'm not referring to scientists who do science, but to philosophers of science who study how scientists do science. Let's go back to Chalmers' book. What is this thing called science? The book starts how we started out the other day, with the widely accepted claim that science is reliable because it is based on facts. Next, most of the book is dedicated to proving that this statement is incorrect. And the last part explains why, despite everything, we can continue to trust science. Today we are going to go over a very brief summary of some of the ideas that Chalmers presents in the book. But I recommend that you read it for yourselves. We are going to give you the links to download the book in PDF, in Spanish, and in English in the chat section. And you can find what we're going to cover today in chapters 1 through 8. We said that everyone knows that science is based on facts, facts that we can confirm as such through our senses. I know because I've seen it with my own eyes. Okay. What do you see here? This image can be found in Chalmers' book, and he says that every time that he shows it to people, the answer is always a staircase. But where is the staircase placed? Some people see the staircase resting on the ground. Others see it hanging from the ceiling. And many people can see both. The same image, two distinct perceptions. I'm sure that all of you see a staircase, either on the ground or hanging from the ceiling. But when this image was shown to people from African tribes who were not used to seeing perspective drawings, they didn't see stairs, but a series of lines in distinct directions. Horizontal, vertical, lineal. What do we want to say with this? That our perception is not objective. That what we see not only depends on what is in front of our eyes, but also what our previous experiences are. Let's look at another example. The majority of us recognize a human thorax in this X-ray image. But if there are any doctors or radiologists attending, I am sure that they see much more and probably recognize what the rest of us see as spots, as someone who could have pneumonia and probably tuberculosis. The same thing happens when we learn how to look through a microscope or a telescope. The more we look, the more things we see. But perception does not only depend on experience. It also depends on other things like expectations. Sometimes we see what we hope to see or what we want to see, and that is why police know that eyewitnesses are not reliable. And if they can choose, they prefer camera images over a person. Okay, now we're back to how we were the other day. So what? We can't do science because we can't trust our senses? It's not about that. As we have said before, most of us agree that there is an objective reality that we can access with our senses. But it is important to recognize the limitations of perception. Accepting what we see is usually reliable. How can we use the empirical evidence of what we see to do science? Or in other words, how do we get from observation to scientific knowledge? The other day, we explained the most immediate way to do this when we talked about the scientific method. But today, we're going to go into a little more detail. Normally, when we do science, we do not start from a single observation, but, as Brand's definition says, from repeated observations. Imagine that we go to the park and we see a large white bird in the water with a very long neck. And at another pond, we see a group of the same birds with long necks that are also white. If this observation is repeated many times, we can conclude that all large, long-necked water birds, which we call swans, are white. The process of moving from many individual observations to a general conclusion is called induction. Inductivism is a philosophical current according to which scientific knowledge is generated by accumulating information from many independent facts and then reaching a generalization. For this to work, a series of requirements must be met. Obtaining a large number of observations in different circumstances. Going to the same park every day to observe the same swan is not acceptable. And that there is no observation that contradicts the others. Once we have the general conclusion, we can use it to make predictions. If I go to a new park and see a new swan, what color will it be? Well, it would be white. This process of drawing a specific conclusion from a general rule is called deduction. According to inductivists, science works by these two processes. Repeated observations help us to reach general conclusions, induction, which in turn are used to make predictions about future events, which would be deduction. It may seem like a good idea, and in fact, many times it works like this in the practice of science. But at a theoretical level, inductivism has many problems. In the first place, how many observations do we need to reach a conclusion that is safe, that is true? 10? 1,000? 1 million? And once we have reached a conclusion, how can we be sure that a new observation is not going to appear in the future that could ruin everything? A single black swan, which by the way does exist, completely destroys the scientific conclusion that we have reached with thousands of observations of white swans. When philosophers realized the difficulties that inductivism faces, they proposed an alternative. Falsificationism. Falsificationism more or less says the following: we will never be able to assure that a scientific theory is true, because new data can always appear to show that it is wrong. What you have to do is propose hypotheses and try to prove that they were wrong. Try to falsify them. Do experiments and make observations trying to find something that contradicts that hypothesis. If a hypothesis resists all attempts to falsify it, it is because it is a fairly solid hypothesis. We will never be able to say that it is true, but we can trust that it is until we find a better one. The important thing for the falsificationists is that we express hypotheses specifically so that they can be falsified. A good scientific hypothesis has to be falsified or falsifiable. For example, if we say pure water boils at 100 degrees, is a good hypothesis because we can heat water with a thermometer in it, and if when the temperature reaches 100 degrees, the water does not bubble, the hypothesis will have been falsified. However, the phrase, tomorrow it may or may not rain, is not a good scientific hypothesis because it cannot be falsified. It is always true. No matter what, if it rains or not, the hypothesis is, it's true. Horoscopes and politicians are usually good sources of non-falsifiable hypotheses. They say such ambiguous things that they are never wrong. Falsificationism also seems like a good way to do science, but it too has its problems. Here, the basic idea is that if a hypothesis is shown to be false, it should be discarded. But it turns out that a clause can always be added to it so that it remains valid, even though it has been falsified. For example, a black swan makes our hypothesis that all swans are white false, but instead of rejecting it completely, we can modify it by saying all swans in Europe are white because black swans are from Australia, and thus we've saved it. In the case of the boiling temperature, I'm sure that many of you thought that it is a true hypothesis, but it turns out that it's not. If we heat water on the top of a mountain, the water starts to boil before reaching 100 degrees because there's less atmospheric pressure. So to save this hypothesis, we could say pure water boils at 100 degrees at sea level. A more serious problem with falsificationism is that when an experiment or an observation seems to show that the hypothesis is false, we cannot be sure whether it is really false or if there's a problem with the way we are doing the observation or the experiment. When scientists in the 16th century were debating whether the Earth was the center of the universe or orbited around the sun, someone came up with the following experiment. If the planets revolve around the sun and not around the Earth, Mars and Venus will sometimes be close to the Earth and sometimes they will be very far away. So their size would have to vary greatly throughout the year. But it turns out, when we look at the sky, those differences in size are barely appreciated, which would seem to falsify the heliocentric theory. How is that possible? We know that the Earth revolves around the sun. Later, it was discovered that our eyes are not able to calculate the size of small, bright objects on a dark background very well. And then when we look through a telescope, the difference is visible. The history of science is full of similar cases. If we study the beginnings of many scientific theories that seem perfectly valid today, we will see that some of the first experiments that were done on them gave results that seemed to falsify the hypothesis. If scientists had rejected the hypothesis the first time, a falsificationism proposes, science would not have advanced. Fortunately, scientists are often stubborn and do not give up on their ideas easily. All this, the problems of inductivism, falsificationism, and the stubbornness of the scientists were realized by a physicist and philosopher named Thomas Kuhn in the 1960s. Kuhn thought that the best way to study how science works was to observe scientists, not individually, but in groups, to see how the scientific community works over time. Kuhn concluded that scientists work within a present framework for each field of science, which includes what is known up to that point and is not questioned. This is what is known as a paradigm. For a long time, the astronomy paradigm was that the Earth was the center of the universe, and astronomers of that time proposed their hypotheses, did their experiments, and reached their conclusions, making new discoveries, but always within that paradigm. They never went outside of it. Kuhn recognizes that each field of science can tolerate a number of anomalies, data that does not fit, without considering that the paradigm could be wrong. But if the number of anomalies is very large, or if these anomalies are very serious, some scientists in the community will begin to doubt the paradigm, and a crisis will ensue. From that moment on, two groups are formed: those who cling to the classic way of seeing things, and those who believe that no longer works and start to seek a new alternative, which in the previous example would be that the Earth is a planet in the solar system and that it moves around the sun. The two paradigms will continue to conflict for a time while scientists from both sides search for and accumulate new data that favor them. But the final result does not depend only on the amount of data that each one obtains. Social, political, and even religious factors influence the duration and outcomes of these crises. Sometimes decades have to pass, and no change occurs until a whole generation of scientists dies. Eventually, if the new paradigm is accepted by the majority, things settle down and a new period of normal science begins, in which the scientists work within the framework of the new paradigm. This paradigm shift cycle is called scientific revolution. One wonders if the new paradigm is always better than the old one. Kuhn thought so, but I'm not so sure. If we tried to represent the different ways of doing science that we have talked about today and the relationship with the truth in a graph, we would have something like this. The red line at the top represents the truth, and the blue line represents scientific knowledge over time, moving from left to right. Inductivism and falsificationism, each in their own way, believe that science progresses continuously towards a better understanding of the world, towards truth. Kuhn believes that progress is made in leaps and bounds, with each new paradigm being an advance toward truth. But I think a better graph would be this one. It's not mine. I have borrowed it from my colleague and friend Timothy Standish. There is truth, the red line, but science does not always move towards it. Throughout history, science has sometimes been closer and sometimes further from the truth. And some scientific paradigms have been especially damaging to the scientific search for truth. That is the case of the paradigm that dominates the natural sciences today and is known precisely as naturalism. Naturalism is the framework and working premise of today's scientists. It maintains that nature is the only thing that exists and that only natural causes can be considered in the development of scientific hypotheses. Naturalism is so embedded in modern science that there are authors, such as the paleontologist Niles Eldredge, who include it in the definition of science. This author says, if there is one rule, one criterion that makes an idea scientific, it is that it must invoke naturalistic explanations for phenomena. Most of the time in sciences and in most research, this is not a problem because looking for natural explanations is exactly what scientists do. I study sea turtles, and if I had to propose a hypothesis about how turtles know how to find the beach where they were born after 15 years, it wouldn't occur to me to say that each turtle has an angel that guides it. I believe that God designed sea turtles and equipped them with a kind of compass in the brain that is capable of detecting the Earth's magnetic field. Newly hatched turtles record that GPS position of the beach in their brains and are thus able to return years later. It is just as amazing, but it's natural. But what happens when there are phenomena for which there is no convincing natural explanation, such as the origin of the universe or the origin of life? And what is more important, what if the truth, what really happened at times in the history of the earth, had some kind of supernatural component? A scientist working within the paradigm of naturalism is forced to propose natural causes for everything, even if they're not convincing, even if they're highly speculative, and even if he is convinced that they are false, because he cannot do otherwise. In a debate on the teaching of science in American schools, a leading scientist said that even if the biblical creation were true, he would be forced to deny it in order to remain a scientist. Do you realize how far the problem goes? Those of us who believe that the Bible tells the truth about how life was created on the earth, about miracles, about Jesus himself, we believe that God has intervened and still intervenes in nature, in the history of humanity, and in the life of people. But according to modern science, anyone who thinks that way is not a scientist. If we go back to the graph from before, it seems as if part of the truth is blocked and we're not allowed to get close to it. If the truth has supernatural components, but modern science does not even consider that possibility, then scientific knowledge can never arrive at the truth. And therefore, science ceases to be a sincere search for truth. Leonard Brand makes a detailed analysis of this topic in Chapter 5 of the book that I mentioned before, Faith, Reason, and Earth History. And the previous chapters 1 through 4 are also very interesting for all of those who want to delve into the concepts of this first module. What is science? How scientists work, the different philosophical perspectives on science, etc. All this from the perspective of a Christian scientist and a creationist with several decades of experience. As you can imagine, Dr. Brand has faced the problem of imposing naturalism in modern science many times. On page 59 of the book, he asks, why does science cling so strongly to this conclusion? Naturalism. And in response, he uses a very illuminating quote from an evolutionary biologist named Richard Lewontin. It's a long quote, but I think it's worth reading the whole thing. So we're going to put it on the screen and read it. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense and the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, we are forced by our priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated, Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Naturalism is not necessary for science to function properly. Science today has consciously decided beforehand to work within the framework of naturalism because it does not want, under any circumstances, to allow God or religion to interfere in scientific work. Perhaps part of the blame for this situation is ours, the church, the Christian church, which at times in the past wanted to control knowledge and impose its ideas using force, coercion, and violence. Another part of the blame may lie with people in the scientific community who prefer to eliminate God from the equation so they do not have to face the moral implications of admitting the possibility of his existence. But the important thing is not who is to blame, but to know if the situation can change and how to do it. For Leonard Brand, the solution is simple. Science, to be truly objective, should not impose naturalism. It should leave all doors open, all causes, natural and unnatural, and follow a rigorous study to where the evidence leads us to reach the truth. Fortunately, Dr. Brand is not the only one who thinks this way. Today, there are more and more scientists from different fields who question the validity of naturalism and want to practice science in a more open way, contemplating all the possibilities. Some even say that we are in one of the crises that Kuhn spoke about, and that the paradigm shift is coming. Time will tell. I would like to finish with an idea that is probably the most important of everything that I've said today. The other day, someone asked how we can help people who don't believe in God to see science from our perspective. It's impossible. You cannot believe in the Creator if you do not believe in God first. So perhaps we should start at the beginning and help people to get to know Jesus and grow closer to him. If the attitude of these people does not allow us to tell them about Jesus, we can still show them what Jesus is like with our actions. Jesus is the truth. Science is a search for truth. If we bring people closer to Jesus, we will be bringing them closer to the truth, and perhaps that will open their eyes to see that there is a better way to do science.